that, yeah, strawberry thing, some kind of strawberry thing. And then, no, it wasn't that. It was some kind of, I don't even know, just some kind of strawberry. Some girl on the porch when we were trick or treating, like she recognized it. She's like, "Oh, this is a something."
You're like, yeah, whatever.
Yeah, whatever it was. I don't know what it was. And then, but I don't even think my little girl knew. I think that she just liked the strawberry outfit. I don't even think she knew what it was supposed to be. Like, and then my boy, he was, man, I loved it because he's only 2, and he's got, well, all right, let me back up. The mother-in-law did buy him like this little football outfit, but he's got this older Batman costume that he wore last year, and I just had to make him wear that again. Like, even if like somebody got mad, because he just looks so cute in the thing, man. Because he's only this tall, you know what I mean? And he's got this little Batman mask on. And he's just falling all over the road.
This family came to my house. The dad was Batman. The mom was like Catwoman, and he had a daughter. And one of them was the Riddler, the Joker, and like the Penguin or something.
That guy, yeah.
Bat family.
Yeah, that guy is living his life out through his kids. That's what's happening. Can't wait to Halloween. I can live out my fantasy. So, yeah, that guy's just living his life out.
At first, it kind of shocked me. I was like, all right.
Yeah. Well, like, all right, like I mean, I like Halloween. It's just kind of fun, and there's something fun about it. But some people honestly creep me out at Halloween. I mean, I guess that's appropriate at being Halloween or whatever. You get creeped out, but I mean, there are some people, man, like, you know what I'm talking about? Well, no, that doesn't creep me out. That doesn't creep me out. It just kind of, pisses me off. Like, look, hey, man, if you don't have a flipping mask on, like, just turn around because I'm not giving you any candy.
Yeah.
Dude, you walk up here in your flipping T-shirt and your jeans, you're not even going to make the effort to put a
404 error, no costume.
No, dude, you don't even make the effort for that. You don't even make the effort to put on a pillow on your head or something, like, right, dude, man. I mean, did you not have a sheet you could cut 2 holes in? Like, you're not making the effort. You're just not getting any candy. That's just the rule at our house. But anyway, but some of the people that creep me out, what I'm saying, it's like you've got this neighbor or somebody, some guy that lives in your neighborhood, and then all of a sudden on Halloween, he comes out of the house and just, looks like Satan himself or something. Like, you're just like, what is this? This guy, man, has been waiting all year to look just like, you know what I'm saying? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
They just, I mean, like, that guy has been in front of the mirror for probably 3 hours.
Today, just looking.
Yeah, just with this, all right, man, I'm this gore, like, and like, man, that's just, you're creeping me out, man. Like, you're the guy I'm going to keep my eye on, like, the rest of the year. Like, if you're doing that on Halloween, like, you've got this knife, man, and it looks like you've just killed like 80 people, and it's got all this blood on it, and you've got blood on your head. Like, you're the guy, man. Mid-June, I'm keeping my eye on you, man. You know what I'm saying? Right. I mean, the guy that just gets all into, like, I mean, I really get into the dark side of Halloween. Like, all right, man, I'm watching you. Yeah, I'm watching you, man. In September, like those, you're creeping me out. You're the creepy guy. So now, all right. Historically speaking, what was yesterday has had much more impact. Well, but even more so what historical event took place? In fact, some people call it this because it has a huge impact. Like, all of you are affected right now, whether you know it or not. Huh? What happened? Or what? We have good reason to believe happened on October 31st. 15 what?
Somebody did
something.
Everybody in this room right now is impacted by this. What happened? October 31st.
Somebody.
Martin Luther does what?
Explode.
Well, no, he didn't explode. Unless you mean unless you mean figuratively. The white one.
Oh, he stapled some shit to the door.
Well, they didn't staple it because they didn't have a staples yet.
Like he nailed some shit to the door.
95 Theses to the door, right? Right? Reformation Day. Some people call it Reformation Day.
He said, "Fuck this shit, I'm out." He walked away.
Well, it wasn't that drastic. He really wanted what? What did he want to do?
Church will blow up.
No, he didn't want that. What is it? You're blowing up something today. I'm keeping an eye on this guy. In less than 25 seconds, 2 references to something blowing up. What did he want to? What did he want to do? What was his point?
Well, he wanted the church to reform, but he knew it wasn't going to.
Well, he wanted it to, right? That's what his point was. He's like, look, man, there's some screwed up stuff going
Stop
on.
doing the shit you're doing.
He's like, there's some really messed up stuff here. And so he got in trouble, right? So anyway, October 31st, he nails the 95 Theses to the door. Anybody, extra points if you can tell me the door? Well, I mean, that's kind of obvious. Hey, we need some siding on this building over here. All right, anyway. All right, so let's start. This is a fun one, utilitarianism. This is almost as fun as relativism. Well, maybe, but I'm not using it. Yeah, you just copy down your PowerPoint and turn it in for your
I
paper.
did. I told you that.
Yeah,
By the way, I copied this off my PowerPoint.
yeah. This works.
I know.
All right, so what is utilitarianism? What is it? Is it an ethical theory? All right, strike 3. Strike 3, security.
It would be explosive event.
It'll be.
Hey, I invented a joke yesterday when we were walking around trick or treating, and I really honestly might get in trouble for this. But I just think it's kind of funny. What did the black duck call the white duck?
A duck quacker?
Quacker. I said that yesterday we were walking. I was like, I don't know, it just popped in my head because some kids dress like a duck. Didn't like it, made it just pop in my head. But see, that's kind of, if you get in trouble for that, come on, man. All right, anyway. So what is utilitarianism? Look, I'm out of here. Not listening to it. What is this? What is it?
It's a thing.
Well, I mean, so is this.
And there we go. See, they're the same ballpark, generally speaking.
Oh my, no, not even generally. You're at the base of metaphysics. Like they're both things in the sense of being. All right, is this an ethical theory or a happy meal? Right, it's an ethical theory, right? So when we're talking about our ethical theories, what are we looking at? What is an ethical theory supposed to do for you? What's it supposed to help us do?
Show us how to understand what we do and why we do.
Right, look, help us to determine the right, right?
Yeah.
Or the good, the right, and how to apply that to our lives, how to do the right.
Follow it, everything you do is good.
Yeah, I mean, roughly speaking, I mean, that might be a little simplistic, but roughly speaking, I mean, that might work. So this ethical theory is supposed to, if you apply it, it's supposed to help you establish the good, right? Help us to know what the good is, right? And it's supposed to be an applicable system, meaning that it's supposed to what? Help you to do that, right? Not only to ground the good in some sense, at least in some sense of the word, right? But to help you to do it. So is this a descriptive ethic or is it a prescriptive ethic? No, not descriptive, right? Because what does it want to do? You what? You ought to behave this way, right? If this system works, then this is how you ought to behave, right? And what kind of system is that? What kind of is that descriptive or prescriptive? If it's what you ought to do, is that descriptive or prescriptive? Prescriptive, right? Because remember, prescribing behavior. This is how you're supposed to behave. And remember, all of these that we look at are going to be what? Prescriptive ethical theories, right? They're supposed to show you how to behave, and what? It's supposed to give you in some way the good. It's supposed to ground it, because remember, what is our bigger metaphysical question about meta-ethics? Remember, some of these are supposed to be answers to how we can get what? True right, true wrong out of what? Right. Especially signs, what? Some sort of divine revelation or God or whatever, right? Remember, these are supposed to give us these, right? This is supposed to help, also not just help you to live a certain way in regards to morality, but it's supposed to also help at least ground the good, right? Right? At least in some sense, it's supposed to do that. Now, utilitarianism. What is utilitarianism? Does anybody know?
Like the word inside utility, it's for the common good, and it's good. If the majority of people find your actions useful.
Right. So utilitarianism is sometimes called what? Consequentialism, right? Because it's concerned with what? The consequences, right? It's the consequences are what matter, right? So utilitarianism, the basic axiom for this foundational point that this is built on is what? You kind of said it, Piper.
The fact that it's good for the majority of
Right. How do we determine the good? All right, this is it right here. And there's a couple of different ways to state this, but we'll kind of go with something like the classic definition, something like this. Whatever provides the greatest, what? The greatest pleasure for what?
the mass,
The greatest number of people.
the greater good.
For the greatest number, right? Sometimes this will be something like greatest pleasure, what leads to the greatest flourishing, something like that. Some kind of, I mean, again, that can be sparsed out differently, but we're going to go in with the old school version of that. So the greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people, what, right? Whatever. So what? How do you think that's going to work? Whatever the right course of action is what? In any given situation is what? What will do what? Provide this, right? Whatever the right course of action is, whatever is going to provide this, the greatest pleasure, what will end up the consequence being the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, or what leads to the most flourishing, something to that effect, right? Does that make sense? Now, before we get into, there's two different types. There's called act utilitarianism and rule. And we'll get into that in a second. But before we get into that, what do you think what are probably some of the positives? What's some of the appeal of utilitarianism? How many of you are philosophy majors? 0, right? Now, you're not a philosophy major, but does this seem relatively simple to apply to you? All right, look, whatever I do right now, would this bring the most benefit or the most pleasure to the most people? Like, do you have to be a philosophy major to basically understand that point? Right, it's not some super philosophical, abstract concept that you really don't even have a clue as to wrap your mind around it, right? So that might be something like the first appeal. Does that make sense? What might be another appeal? At least in theory, it's supposed to be easy to apply. We'll get into that. But what might be another appeal? I mean, think about it. Shouldn't be that difficult to think of something that might be a positive of this. Let's go ahead and listen to that one while you wake up.
Where?
So remember, our deontological ethics, and we haven't talked about those yet. So just briefly, deontological ethics don't take the consequences of an action into account, right, when they decide to do the right thing, right? Does that make sense? So remember, a deontological ethic would be something like the Nazis come knocking on the door at Corrie ten Boom. You remember Corrie ten Boom from when you were a kid and you had to read some of the stuff? They come knocking at the door. She's hiding Jews, right? And they say, do you have any Jews in your house? Deontology would say what? You tell the truth. To hell with the consequences. You do the right thing and what? You let the consequences what? Happen. You let the consequences worry about themselves. You do the right thing regardless. So utilitarianism avoids what? The seemingly strict and overly legalistic, staunchly principled what? Ethical theory of something like deontology would give you in that circumstance, right? Because in that circumstance, it doesn't seem, at least on the face of it, it doesn't seem like that you should just say what? Oh man, yeah, for the sake of principle, yeah, I've got Jews in here. And then they all get slaughtered, right? That didn't seem, at least on the face of it, as the right thing to do, right? Utilitarianism takes that into account, doesn't it? Does it not? It seems like it can take something like that, a difficult situation, into account, right? So does that seem to be an appeal of utilitarianism? Yeah, right? That seems, at least, on the face of it, to be an appeal. So I'll just read you this as ethicist Scott Ray says it here. He says, second, it avoids the rigidity of deontology. That is, it keeps morality from being reduced to abstract principles that must be strictly followed regardless of consequences produced by them. Now, what's another? I'm just going to say it seems intuitively obvious that you ought to do what? Take into consideration the consequences of what you do. I mean, right? Does that not just seem obvious? That when you do something, that when you act a certain way, that before you make some big decision, it just seems obvious that you should take into account what? Right, the consequences. Like, what will happen if I do this, to my family or my friends or my country or whatever the case may be. Right, so there's a couple different, so far we've listed what, 1, 2, 3, 4, something like 4, seemingly positive things about it. Now, the last one is supposed to be the big one. We'll see how this works as we kind of cash this out. Is it supposed to operate around a non-moral or amoral principle? Now, why might that have appeal? This being it right here. Now, and remember that non-moral or amoral principle would be this right here, this greatest amount of pleasure for the greatest number of people. That's supposed to be kind of non-moral or amoral. Now, why might that be some sort of appeal? Because as we continue to progress in a certain direction in our society, what does our society, what does our culture look like? What is it not like? What is it not, or what is it moving away from? It's trying to move away from all this language about morality and how you ought to be, versus how I ought to be, and all this kind of stuff, right? So this is supposedly a neutral kind of appeal. Does that make sense? This is supposed to not be grounded or have anything to do with, anyone's, moral this, that, or the other, or even specifically any sort of religion, right? So this is supposed to have a broad sort of appeal with no, moral connotations, and then even specifically not necessarily tied to any sort of religious any sort of religious context. Does that make sense? So that's supposed to be appealing to what? The majority of people, regardless of wherever you land on what sort of spectrum. Does that make sense? Now, real quickly, we'll talk about this. Act utilitarianism, and we're going literally 20 seconds. What do you think this one's going to be concerned about, act utilitarianism? These are just kind of sub-branches within as a whole. This is going to take into account every single act, the consequences, right? Every single act It's going to take the consequences into account. Rule utilitarianism is supposed to be something like, well, we've already been able to determine that these specific types of actions wouldn't result in the greatest good or greatest flourishing or greatest pleasure. So just in principle, but based on utilitarian principles, there's a certain few number of things that we just wouldn't do in any certain situation, like rape or lie or something like that. So they kind of have these rules. Now, I kind of think that this is, and we'll get into that, I kind of think that doesn't work. I mean, just because the way utilitarianism is just supposed to work, but we'll get into that. So what we're going to look at for the most part is act utilitarianism, and then we'll touch on the rule part. Now, what do you think, just on your own, might be some problems with utilitarianism?
It sounds a lot like saying that the end is justified.
Well, I mean, that's exactly what it says, right? Does everybody know what that means? Has anybody ever heard that? Has anyone ever heard that the ends justify the means? Now, have you ever heard also, too, that the saying, the ends never justify the means? If somebody says, well, this will happen and this will happen if we do this and this, and somebody says, look, man, the ends don't justify the means. Have you ever heard that? Never heard that? Jeez. Basically, those are two ethical theories that are in direct contrast with one another. Utilitarianism says what? That it does. That the ends justify the means. Now, what does that mean? Analogously there, we're using equivocating on the word mean, but what does that mean to say that?
It means that whatever you have to do to get a certain result is perfectly fine as a result of it.
Right, so long as the result what?
It's good for everyone.
Right, or produces the greatest amount of pleasure.
So if you could save the world by burning 3,000 babies, then it's okay.
All right, so let's try to cash that out, because the utilitarian would immediately say, wait a minute. I don't know if that's going to be the case ever, right? Right, does that make sense? All right, so what are some, in light of some of the positives, some of the appeals of utilitarianism, aside from something crazy like that, like Piper just said, what might be the drawback or some drawbacks of utilitarianism? Think. Now, remember, just so you know, a guy named Jeremy Bentham, he's kind of the big leader of this, and then one of his disciples, so to speak, is John Stuart Mill, who refines it a little bit. But this is where it kind of gets its historic roots. And again, that's not super important. I just want you to at least know that, because at the time when this utilitarianism was developed, it was pretty radical, because at that time, all morality, and at least in one sense, had something to do with observation of nature, had something to do with special revelation or divine, commands and all this kind of stuff. Now, when this came around, this was completely divorced from that, because it was born in the Enlightenment era, right? When everybody and everything is detaching away from tradition and detaching away from religious thought and all that kind of stuff. And so you're getting an ethical theory that's supposed to also be able to get away from that sort of baggage, right? That metaphysical baggage that comes along with all those sorts of other theories. Now, first and foremost, let's the first one. What can utilitarianism? We're starting to look at some of the problems of it. What can utilitarianism almost never do? What can it almost never do? Because remember, if we want to break this down, the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, that can almost always, in one way, break down to numbers, right? Data, crunching numbers and statistics, right? Right? Now, what can this almost never do? Think. It can almost never protect the rights of who? Well, there wouldn't be rights, but it can almost never protect who? Who? Well, no, not that. It does a good job at that. That can almost never protect who? Minorities. Why? Well, you're not the majority. And so what are some examples of that? What are some examples of that? Utilitarianism can almost never protect who? Minorities. Why?
Based on majority.
All right, so what are some examples? What are some examples? You've at least been to high school, so I know you have some historical examples where you can think about this. Put that theory into practice with some of your history. What about freaking slavery? You don't have to go to segregation yet, right? What about slavery? Can utilitarianism, is that wrong under utilitarianism? Why? It's only wrong if what? No, not because everybody did it. It's only wrong, why? If what? If it doesn't produce the greatest pleasure for the greatest number. In the American South, did it produce the greatest pleasure for the greatest number? Yes, by far, right? Meaning that more people benefited, the lives of most people were benefited in the American South by having slaves than not having slaves, right? So, now this is what I really want you to catch. What was the right thing to do in that situation? No, on utilitarianism, what was the right thing to do?
Keep it going.
Right, to have slaves, to keep it going, right? Now, does utilitarianism justify the slave trade? This is a trick question. Does it justify the slave trade? Does it justify it? This is what I really want you to get. Does it justify the slave trade? No, it doesn't justify it. It what? It what? What is the good? How do we determine the good? How do we determine the good on utilitarianism? The good, what is right? How do we determine that? Already said it 50 times. How do we determine it? What determines the greatest pleasure, the greatest amount of flourishing for the greatest number is what? The good. So does it justify the slave trade? No, it doesn't justify it. It what? No. It's more radical than justifying the slave trade. It what? It says it's the good. That's the right thing to do. Not that it justifies it. It says it's like you ought to do this. Remember? What kind of ethic are we looking at? Prescriptive. Remember? How you ought to behave. Remember, if I'm a utilitarian, it tells me how I should act, right? It tells me, Russ, you're confused, you don't know what to do, you don't know what the moral choice in this situation is. You apply this principle to find out what the right thing to do is. Not to justify your action, but to what? Show me what? Show me the right thing to do. In this situation, I'm not looking to justify my action. I want to know what I'm supposed to do. What makes me moral? What makes me moral right here? Kidnapping people and making them what? And so does that justify my behavior? Or does it what? It says that's the right behavior. It doesn't say it's okay in this circumstance. It says it's the right course of action. This is what makes you moral. Does that make sense? This is what makes you a good person, by doing what? Keeping the slave trade going, right? Does that make sense what I'm saying? Do you see what I'm saying? What I'm trying to get through your head is that, look, this doesn't justify certain behaviors. It tells you how you're supposed to be. Does that make sense? Remember, all of these ethical theories that we go through, utilitarianism, divine command theory, any other deontological type of ethics like Kant's, virtue theory, natural law, all those are going to tell you that's going to tell you how you're supposed to be. That's what's going to help you be a moral person, right? So, what's another example of this? What about those Christian guys over in those particular countries where they're getting their heads lopped off? There's minorities there, right? Now, if that in some way provides the greatest pleasure or the greatest amount of flourishing for the greatest number, then what is that? What is that behavior there? Is it immoral or moral? On utilitarianism. It's the right thing to do. If that provides the greatest flourishing or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, then you ought to lop their heads off, right? You ought to kill them. Does it justify that behavior? No, it doesn't justify it. What? It's the right thing to do, right? Right? What's another example of that? What's another minority type example? Let's say you have a little yappy dog. I can't stand yappy dogs. So let's say, you know what I mean when I say yappy dogs? They're like the dog. Any dog that makes a lot of noise and is the size that a hawk could come away and carry off is a yappy dog.
Basically a dog that just bounces every time.
Right. It's just a crazy genetically modified mole rat or something. Now, let's say that you have a little yappy dog. Just aggravate everybody to flipping death in an apartment complex. Let's say nobody likes the thing. Nobody. And let's say that one guy's like, all right, nobody likes this dog. It's driving everybody bat snap crazy. And let's say this guy is a total utilitarian. What's the right thing to do? Let's say there's no muzzles, any of that kind of thing. You get rid of it, right? You either kill it or whatever, right? If that what? Provides the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Would it be right? Does that mean that you can just go around and kill yappy dogs just because you don't like them? Because, they aggravate people? No. I mean, that seems to be a problem, right? Would the guy get in trouble if the cop showed up and you're like, why'd you do that? Well, because nobody liked this dog. It was aggravating everybody, so I put a stick through its skull. Would the cops be like, oh, you're utilitarian, so I didn't know? Would that be right? Would they buy that?
No.
Probably not, right? In fact, try that. Well, I'm a utilitarian, man. Like, greatest pleasure for the greatest number. Now, think of a different example. Let's say that all of us in this classroom right now are on a plane. Let's say we're going to some little study abroad program. Hell, we can study philosophy abroad. We're going to Greece. We're going to walk the Areopagus and the Academy and all these sorts of things. All right, so let's say on the way we get into a plane crash, right? We run into bad weather and we end up on our little island or whatever. Well, let's say I stand up and I'm like, hey guys, I'm your teacher and I'm a utilitarian. And let's say I'll argue for utilitarianism, right? And let's say that you guys adopt it. You're like, all right, yeah, whatever provides, for our little island here, whatever's going to provide the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, that's how we ought to behave. Now, let's say that, God forbid, we find out that one of us, and we don't necessarily know who, but one of us is a psychopath. Let's say, it's Piper over here wants to blow up stuff. Now, the good news is there's nothing that he can use to blow up anything, right? But let's say, and you know, I mean, this is pretty blunt and graphic, but we're looking at this theory here. So let's say that one of them is a serial rapist. It's just awful. Well, so in an effort to say, we don't want our little island to be terrorized, we don't want our pleasure to go down. Let's say we set aside one person, one woman or whatever, we'll set her aside, you know, take her somewhere where we don't have to watch this, and every day that guy gets to go do whatever he wants to. Every day. Every day. Because what? Even though she is in hell, miserable for the rest of her existence, what happens? What happens? We're all what? We're all happy, right? Why are we all happy? Because our pleasure is what? Because we're fine, right? We're growing our little, you know, garden and doing whatever else. We don't have to worry about so-and-so over there across the island, right? But is that right?
No.
In fact, that's kind of like that movie, The Purge, right? That's just a consequentialist ethic. All right, we'll let this happen because these are the results. We'll let people go ape nuts once a year because that produces nice results. Even if what? Even if innocent people and children get raped and murdered and, you know, pedophiles get their kicks, you know, we'll let them have it once a year because the results are nice. That's consequentialism. That's that movie, The Purge, that's utilitarian ethic. It's the right thing to do. And here's the crazy thing. Remember, does it justify it? No, it says it's right. Like you are a moral society if you tie the girl up over there and let that happen. Not that you're justifying. You're not just justifying it. It's what? That's what you ought to do. That's how you ought to behave. Right? Now here's where the rule utilitarian says, wait. No. We have this rule based on utilitarian principles that it would always produce more harm than good to allow that to happen. Well, my question to this guy is, how do you know that? How do you know? If you've already have it a priori set aside that you can't do something like that, well, how do you ever know what? More quote unquote pleasure or flourishing. Right? Now, you sound more like a deontologist. He's got this certain ethical principle that he can't violate no matter what, because it'll end up bringing bad consequences. But how do you know? How does he know that? I mean, isn't utilitarianism just saying that we see what the behavior is and then see the consequences to know the right from the wrong? Well, how can this guy smuggle in some principle just because he doesn't, you know, it sounds like he doesn't, it doesn't sound like he just doesn't like it. It sounds like he's saying it'll bring the most harm, but how does he know that? In fact, we just created a little thought experiment where it wouldn't bring the most harm, right? Now, you might say something like Jeremy Bentham had something called a hedonistic calculus, where you start to try to add up and crunch all these numbers to see what would bring the most pleasure to the greatest number. But let's say it causes us distress knowing that that's going on over there. Well, one, my question would be, well, why is that causing us distress if it's the right thing to do? But aside from that, let's say it does. It causes us distress, and let's say our pleasurable, our number on the hedonistic calculus goes down out of 0 to 100. It goes down to 50. Each person, we don't have 100% pleasure because for whatever reason it kind of distresses us that's going on over there. But let's say for the girl, she's at 99.9. No, let's just say she's at 100 max displeasure. I mean, she's in hell, right? But you take Madeline's 50 and my 50 and Hannah's 50, we're already way above her 100, right? Even though I'm only at 50 and you're at 50 and you're at 50, the max pleasure is still greater than what? It's still greater than what? Unless the rapist, what if his pleasure is at 100? Too, because he gets to do whatever he wants, right? So the max pleasure is still greater than numbers were, even in regard to that, even if everybody else has much less pleasure because they're distressed about it. The numbers are still working out that that's the way you ought to behave. And remember, not just that justifies it, but that's the way what? That's what you what? Ought to do, right? That's what makes you moral. Does that make sense? Now, think about this one. Think about, let's look at the culture that we live in now with all this tension going on, and within, races and cultural climates and all this kind of stuff. Let's say that you have a guy that's 100%, let's say there's video evidence of this guy committing a crime or whatever. And not just any crime. Again, one of those things that we just intuitively see is just despicable, just completely egregious. You know that he's guilty. I mean, he's guilty as hell. I mean, he's guilty. What he's done, you can't even stomach watching what he's done. But let's say that you're a jury of utilitarians, you know that if you convict him, then there'll be riots, society will erupt, you'll have chaos for the next month and a half, 2 months. What do you do? What do you do?
Participate in the purge.
You let him go, right? Even though you know what? That he's guilty of this particular crime. You let him go. Why? Why do you let him go? This right here, look. Why? This right here, right? Because by letting him go, even though you know he's guilty, the family of whatever they've committed, whatever, they'll be devastated. Well, it still provides the greatest pleasure for the greatest number by letting him go. Right? Now, reverse that. Let's say that you have a particular guy who's completely 100% innocent. Completely innocent. Alibi, completely stands up. Video evidence that shows he's not even anywhere near the scene of the crime when it happens. And let's say this guy's he's not an alpha male, so to speak, at all. He's not, a man's man kind of thing. And you know that if he goes to prison, it's not going to be good for this guy. And he's completely innocent. But if you don't convict this guy because of, say, racial tensions or cultural climate or whatever, that if you don't convict this guy, riots, chaos, all that kind of thing, what do you do? What's the right thing to do? Frame him. You set him up and you frame him, right? And you send him to prison, right? Even if his life now turns into hell and he's completely innocent, you've still done what? The good, moral, right thing to do, right? Based on utilitarianism. Now, again, the rule of utilitarianism is guys and try to run in and say, no, as a rule, we don't, it would always produce more harm than good to convict innocent people. Again, how does he know that, right? Especially, let's say that you see the consequence. You could see the outcome. If we convict this guy, even though he's innocent, it will avoid all this over here. How can that guy how does he even have an argument at that point? Right? Does that make sense? Now, a utilitarian, they may say, but wait a minute, the reason this sounds so difficult to you and the reason that you don't like it is because you're already assuming that there's some right or wrong behavior before you look at the consequences of the action. Does that make sense? Like, wait a minute, the reason this sounds bad, the reason you don't like this is because you're already assuming some sort of right or wrong. But this just is what's right or wrong. Does that seem plausible? In fact, in a minute, we'll see if they're assuming something like that as well. But does that seem plausible? Well, if you're a hardcore utilitarian and you want to bite the bullet, you may say, yeah, that's just, you may not like this. It may not, quote unquote, sound good to you, but this just is the way it ought to be. Right? Now, another question that you might bring up is, remember, if this is the greatest pleasure or the greatest amount of flourishing or whatever for the greatest number of people, A legitimate question might be what? What might be a legitimate question to ask in regards to this, in regards to the principle itself? That's your little hint right there. What might be a legitimate question to ask? In fact, when I was in my early 20s and I was listening to a thing about utilitarianism, this was my very first question, this right here. When I heard this was my very first question. What do you think it was? All right, Joshua, what is the good? I'll tell you what the good is. The good is what provides the greatest pleasure, the greatest amount of flourishing for the greatest number of people. And then my first question was, what do you think it might have been? According to who? What do I mean by that? Or what do you think I meant by that?
Because right now, relative to everybody. So,
Well, if this is our maxim, then who's establishing what?
is that what you're asking?
What's the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people according to whose definition? Right? Hitler's? Or
Because, yes.
Or-
That's what I mean, because everything's relative. So like Hitler and the Nazis, he provided the greatest number of pleasure for all of Germany, but for us, it wasn't very good.
well, all right, so what if Hitler says, right, but look, if we do what I want to do, this is going to provide the greatest amount of pleasure. How? Because there'll be no more races. There'll be no more race wars and racism and blah blah blah. There'll be no more governments competing against one another because the Third Reich, all that garbage, will be establishing an empire that lasts 1,000 years. All these sorts of things, right? Or do we say, well, no, the greatest pleasure is for the greatest number according to, say, Mother Teresa or whatever, her axioms. So according to who defines, who sets what is the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, right? So imagine that you have a prison population. Let's say it's the stereotypical prison population where everybody there really is bad or whatever. And let's say that they're, it's the whatever particular floor of max security, type of prison where, it's just bad. Well, let's say some sort of plague sweeps, the nation. Well, those guys are protected how? Right, they're isolated in some sense, right? So the plague wipes out normal civilization, right? What we would consider to be normal civilization. Well, those guys, what they deem to be pleasurable and what they deem to be flourishing for their benefit is going to be radically different than what? Say the tiny little community, like the little Walking Dead community or whatever, than what they might believe, right? Now, what if those guys outnumber the quote unquote, what we would always consider to be the normal people? What if they now outnumber them and they get out? Right, it's what they decide is the greatest pleasure for the greatest number, right? Well, that seems weird, to put it, just, bluntly or frankly or non-philosophically. That seems real weird. That what those guys would consider to be pleasurable, and they're in the majority, excuse me, to say that what those guys is going to produce the greatest amount of pleasure and the greatest amount of good for their group is just really weird, right? Does that make sense? Now, what do you think might be probably the biggest problem with utilitarian? As if we haven't talked about some big problems. What do you think might be the biggest problem?
It's bias.
What?
It's bias.
It's bias.
Well, because it's only working in favor of large groups of people. So no matter what's right or wrong, it just depends on the vast majority of what they believe to be true.
Or what contributes to their flourishing or whatever, right?
Yeah.
Or their pleasure. Now think back to the very first appeal of utilitarianism. Or excuse me, not the very first, but I think it's the third. This one right here. What was the appeal of that? Appealing to a non-moral or amoral criteria to base our system on. What do you think might be wrong with that? At least two things. Well, the first might be this, right? How do you base an entire ethical theory on non-moral criteria? What does that even mean? Does that make sense? What does it mean to say that, hey, I've got this completely non-moral principle on which to found morals or morality? What is that? I don't know what that even means. It may not be self-defeating in that sense, but that just seems.
Talking about making immoral judgments based on moral.
No, they're talking about, hey, here's this basic axiom. There's no moral connotations to it, so it's relatively uncontroversial. Now we can build an ethical system off this. Well, here, what the second problem will cash that out in a little more depth. I think you'll see it. All right. Here's the thing, right? What's utilitarianism? We're all back to square one. What is it supposed to do? What is utilitarianism supposed to do? Just like all the ethical theories, what is it supposed to do?
Show us what's right.
Show us the good, right? Show us how we ought to behave, right? Right. Show us how to be moral people, and in some sense, to ground what? The good, right? Right and wrong, right? Now, here's the problem. I think, to me, this is the biggest problem. All right, somebody tell me what does utilitarianism say? How do we know what's good? What's the principle? Somebody tell it to me. The greatest pleasure. What contributes to the greatest pleasure, the greatest flourishing, whatever, to the greatest number, right? And this was my second question. And again, these weren't original to me. I just stumbled upon, when I asked these, I just stumbled upon, just traditional responses to this, right? So I'm not saying like, oh, I didn't invent any of this, right? I'm too stupid to come up with something original. I just stumbled up on, some classical responses. So my second question was this. If this is supposed to give us the greatest, if this is supposed to tell us the good, the greatest, whatever contributes to the greatest pleasure or flourishing and for the greatest number, that is the good, right? If that's supposed to tell us the good, the question was, who said this is good? This makes sense? What do you have to assume? You already have to assume that this is right, that this is good. Who says this is good? It can't be utilitarianism that tells you this is good. Why? Well, if utilitarianism is supposed to tell you the good, it can't tell you this is good because this is already saying that it's good, right? Utilitarianism is supposed to tell you what's good. It's supposed to ground the good, at least in some sense, tell you how you ought to behave, but why ought I do this? Utilitarianism can't tell me this is good because it already assumes that it's good to contribute to the greatest number or greatest pleasure and greatest flourishing, the greatest number of people. But who says that's any good? Don't you have to already assume that that's good? Don't you already have to assume that that's moral, that you have some sort of moral obligation to provide the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people before you try to build your system on? Don't you already have to assume that that's moral? That you have a moral obligation to do that? But remember, utilitarianism is supposed to be what gives us our what? Moral obligations and duties. But you already had to have some sort of sense of moral obligation to do this. So utilitarianism can't be what ultimately gives you your moral obligations and duties, because you already felt like you already had a moral obligation to do this beforehand. Or we should say utilitarianism assumed that you had a moral obligation to do this beforehand. But utilitarianism is supposed to be what tells you what the good is and what your moral obligations and your moral duties are. So this whole business about it's really non-moral or all moral, no, you really had to smuggle in a moral principle to begin with. This. Does that make sense? You just smuggled in some sort of principle steeped in moral obligation or moral connotations to get this in the door. Does that make sense? Now, is anyone saying that you shouldn't take you shouldn't call your consequences into question, or that you shouldn't take them into account when you make a decision? No. I mean, should you take your consequences into account? Sure, right.
They're just saying that whatever it is.
Well, I mean, if I'm going to say, all right, guys, I'm going to let class go early today or something, would that be right for me to do that? Well, I mean, should I take the consequences into account? Well, yeah. But when does it go wrong? No one is saying that you shouldn't take your consequences into account, right? But what the problem here is, you can't base an entire ethical theory off what? The consequences, right? Why? We just went through about 100 reasons why you can't, right? Because of the results. What happens if you try to take the consequences as your axiom? If you base your entire ethical theory off consequences, what's going to happen? Everything we just said, right? Where it leads to, we should say, everything that what? We just talked about, right? So again, if you're making a decision and somebody says, oh, well, you're a consequentialist, you might say, well, no, I mean, I'm taking my consequences into account, but I'm not trying to base my entire moral view off what? Consequences, right? Now, what are some popular decisions in popular culture that have been based on utilitarianism? Well, tons of political positions that we hold are based on utilitarianism, right? What provides the greatest good for the greatest number of people, right? Or the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, right? I mean, think of the stuff that we see as it pertains to, some of the candidates, some of their positions. You can ask the question, do they hold this position because it's the right thing to do? Or are they saying the right thing to do is just whatever provides the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people? Because if it's that, then that's just utilitarianism, right? Or consequentialism. Does that make sense? So what are some of your thoughts? So go ahead. Somebody else. Well, now, obviously, I think you can probably say at the end of the day, I'm not a utilitarian, in regards to ethical theory. I just don't. Now, you may think that doesn't work. That those arguments, well, those are hard. Those are, I don't necessarily like them, but it's just the nature of reality. That's just how it is. All right. So you have to kind of determine yourself as to whether or not you think that, utilitarianism is worthy to be an ethical theory as a whole, right? But as far as I'm concerned, me to account, the consequences of my actions. But at the same time, I'm not going to build. I don't think it works. And not just works. I'm not a pragmatist. But I don't think it would, quote unquote, be right to what? Hold utilitarianism. I just don't think it holds at the end of the day, right? Now, think about this. I can't say in this class, but there's a particular group in our cultural climate that holds to utilitarianism on almost every view, right? But then they will radically object. And for the record, I don't think it's, I don't think torture's right either. So don't think that I'm trying to make a case for torture. But they'll radically object to, say, waterboarding of prisoners in Guantanamo Bay and all that kind of stuff. What's the difficulty there? What's the problem there? Why are they doing the waterboarding or whatever? Why are they doing it? Torture some prisoner. Why are they doing it? For what reason? Well, but what do they think makes it right? If we don't get information out of this freaking dude, then what? City of Atlanta blows up because we've got terrorist cells running around everywhere. Right? So now you've got a dilemma, don't you? Some sort of ethical problem, right? We torture this guy to get the information out so that everybody in Atlanta doesn't blow up because he wants to be a terrorist or whatnot. Or do we hold some different ethical theory? Right? Now, when I said what I said about the difficulties, there's one particular political group right now that it seems like runs their entire platform off utilitarian principles, but then they'll be the loudest in opposition to that action taking place. When I want to be like, wait a minute, you're the utilitarian. You're saying that what matters or what's right is what provides the greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people. Well, why are you objecting to this over here? Because this would provide what? The greatest pleasure for the greatest number of people, right? What grounds do you have for saying that they can't do this to this guy over here if this is going to save, whatever major metropolis in the American countryside? If you're the utilitarian. Oh, so Russ, you think that that's okay? No, I'm not saying it's okay, but I'm saying that the theory that you're using doesn't give you the grounding to object to it. Does that make sense? So either you need to ditch your utilitarianism over here and every political aspect that you're using it over here, you need to get rid of it and use something else so you can be more consistent over here. Or stick with your utilitarianism here, which I think is a bad idea, but then at least be consistent over here in this situation. You want to be utilitarian, bite the freaking bullet and hold it here too. Right? Does that make sense? You see why I think, again, we get back to this all the time, why philosophy is so important? Because one of the reasons is it shows that the radical just inconsistency that people have. Again, educated people that are supposed to be intellectual, people that are supposed to be leaders of the country, how they can be so inconsistent. Does that make sense? And not just inconsistent, but radically inconsistent. You cannot consistently argue all day long for utilitarian principles over here and then turn around and object to something like that if you want to be consistent. I mean, that's, I'm being charitable. We say that, we call it consistency, right? But what do the laymen call that? Hypocrisy, right? You're a hypocrite. You're saying all this over here is right, the true, the good, whatever, and then over here, that's hypocritical. Does that make sense? Because this is where something like a deontological type ethic that we'll get into. Remember, the deontological ethic, we look at a hard case of that. Do you lie? And the Jews get killed, right? We're like, that does seem too rigid. That seems very mystic and rigid. And then we'll finish up with this. But imagine, again, let's imagine that case. Let's imagine the little boy, the guy, the terrorist, let's say his little boy is brought in. Imagine my little boy in his little Batman costume standing there. Somebody puts a gun straight up to his head and says, if you do not tell us where the information is, we're going to put a bullet through this little boy right here in his little Batman costume, put it right through his skull. Utilitarianism says do it, right? But do you want to do that? Or you say, man, I don't know what the consequences will be, but I know it'd be wrong to do this to this little boy. So remember earlier we thought deontology looked bad because it looked too strict and legalistic, right? But now we want to look at something like, well, maybe deontology is not so bad because I'm not putting a bullet through an innocent little boy, even if the consequences over here might be terrible. Does that make sense? You see why ethical theories are tricky? To do the heavy lifting and the hard work to think through this stuff. Because, I don't know about you, but I want to live a life that's relatively consistent. That I can put all this stuff into practice and live a consistent way. Because I think it's important, to live a life that seeks after the truth. All right, so a lot to digest. Make sure you read all our little theories, remember, in your book. Because you're supposed